Good afternoon and good day to you, wherever you're joining us from today. Welcome to the annual joint conference of Intereconomics and SEPS. My name is Ekaterina Springer, and I'm Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Intereconomics. And it is my great pleasure to moderate this session today on a recovery as an opportunity for revision, preventing a lost generation. I am delighted to welcome today Deborah Revoltella, who is the Director of the Economics Department of the European Investment Bank, Sue Maguire, who's an Honorary Professor at the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath, Robert Pollin, who's the Co-Director of PERI, the Political Economic Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And it is also my great pleasure to welcome the climate activist, Matilda Gettins of Fridays for Future, Munich. First, I would like to remind you, our online audience, that we will take questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of the page in Zoom, as well as via Twitter, using the hashtag IECEPS20. We have a question and answer session at the end of this session, and which everyone can join by asking their questions. Now, COVID-19 is still causing widespread mortality and misery around the world. The pandemic has had devastating health effects among older populations, as the risks of mortality are highly correlated with age. However, the coronavirus pandemic has also caused another, more subtle crisis among young people. Many young workers have lost their income, their hopes of job security, and any real ability to plan for their future. For people who grew up during the Great Recession, this is a devastating setback. A major challenge is the fact that youth unemployment is highly correlated with economic growth, and the economic growth forecast is currently not a cheerful one. So addressing the impact of climate change is high on the EU agenda, but is now the right time to be concerned about climate change when unemployment is destroyed and consumption and investment are paralyzed? Is the EU setting right priorities? During our morning session, Commissioner Gentiloni emphasized the EU's commitment to the green and digital transition. But how can building a clean energy economy be a source of job creation? And in particular, how can EU funding designed to boost digitalisation and sustainability help drive new youth employment? And this is what we're going to discuss today with our distinguished speakers. Now I will immediately turn to Matilda, asking you, Matilda, to share your perspective as a representative of your generation. The floor is yours.
Hello, can everyone hear me? So hello to everyone, to organizers, participants, and to fellow presenters. I am Matilda Gettins, and I was contacted today to speak through my activism as part of the Fridays for Future movement. And for those of you who don't know it, Fridays for Future is a global climate movement, and it's based on the concept of school strikes. The idea is actually quite simple. What's the idea of me and all my other fellow strikers and activists going to school if by the time we're out of further education, by the time we're actually ready to contribute to our society, the world has been irreversibly changed for the worse? And when I say changed for the worse, I mean a scenario in which we've continued emitting emissions at such a rate that we lead to a climate crisis scenario of 2, 3, or 4, even more degrees warming. And it might come as a bit of a surprise that in this discussion today about recovery from the COVID crisis, the crisis I'm talking about is not COVID, but the climate crisis. And that's not because I don't think COVID is a big problem. In fact, I'm going to show, or at least try to show also, how COVID has had disastrous effects on climate policy, but rather because I want to highlight how important it is that when we plan our recovery from COVID, we don't run right back into the crisis scenario we were in before, a scenario in which our kind of day-to-day business was leading to a climate crisis. And that's why, to avoid me and my whole generation as such becoming a lost generation, when planning our recovery, we have to make sure we're fighting both crises together. And that's why today I want to talk a little bit about the effects that I believe to have perceived of COVID on the different subsets of our society regarding climate policy, and how much of COVID and its impacts has taken us further and further from mitigating the climate crisis, but also how maybe we can still turn this around. And I'm not adding that at the end for the sake of optimism or for a happy end, but out of necessity. And what is the correlation between corona and climate? I think what happened a lot in the media initially is that people thought there was this positive correlation, that perhaps corona, through the lockdown it caused, through the reduction in emission in oil consumption and air pollution, could be good for the climate. And this image is absolutely perverted, because the reality was a very different one. In fact, what happened is that COVID, through the attention that it needed, it was a massive crisis, led to a marginalization of the climate crisis. And here, the picture that I've chosen to represent this is the tweet cancelling the COP26. And this tweet here acts symbolically for the cancelling of all sorts of recently emerging efforts surrounding climate politics, as politicians and many other parts of society focused instead on the COVID crisis. And what did I mean when I started talking about recently emerging climate efforts? I mean, if we look back at 2019, we realize it was a year that drastically helped raise climate awareness. This picture here is Hamburg on the 20th of September 2019, the global strike day. And in Germany alone, there were 1.4 million people in the street protesting for more and consequent necessary climate politics. But there were people on the street worldwide. There were polls in which climate started to be the major issues in the eyes of people regarding what policy should be focusing on, being above even issues such as internal security or economy. People were calling for action. But there wasn't much climate policy actually being built yet. There were symbolic measures, such as the German Klimapaket, or promises being made, such as the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which was regarding biodiversity, which is heavily correlated to the climate crisis itself. And there was a growing pressure for direct action. Perhaps if the COVID crisis had not hit us in this moment, we would have been building towards proper climate policy. But then Corona did come. And Corona, as we have heard, simply also through the fact that that is the title of this conference today, is present in all parts of our society. Corona had a massive impact on the media. In this picture here, we can see from 2004 to 2020, the world newspaper coverage of climate change or global warming. And if we look towards the last years, towards 2020, we see like a gradual increase in newspaper coverage of it. And this means that awareness for it was growing. And as awareness grows, so does public pressure in general. And what we see there, however, is the massive dip right after 2020, when all attention was diverted away from the climate crisis towards the COVID crisis. This is a diagram of Twitter's, these are Twitter diagrams in the period from March to July, and we can see that there is an absolute clear focus on this one topic. And the impact on the economy is not much better to be seen. Not only, of course, is it a terrible effect in the sense of unemployment, in the sense of people's livelihoods, but also from a climate perspective, because as economic output dropped, so did the investment to renewable energies. And we can see how the need for renewable energies is shown by this bar chart here, with the light blue being renewable energies and green being investments into the whole network of energy as such, is far from the requirements that we need. And even the hope that a lot of the money would flow into a lot of the money going into recovery would be going into renewable energies. In fact, a recent study has found that from the G20 countries and their investments post-COVID, more money quite clearly here has been flowing into fossil fuels than renewable energies. And the impact on politics is a large one too. Politics is the crucial body in helping us avert the climate crisis, because they are the ones that can set policy framework. And instead, the main goal became business back to usual, which would lead us from one crisis into the next. And at the same time, there was a lack of public scrutiny. That meant that as people were focusing on COVID and the policies that were being passed surrounding COVID, issues and decisions that were being made surrounding climate did not get much attention. This meant that decisions such as the German Kohleausstiegsgesetz, which led to legally binding coal only having to be ended in 2038 instead of 2030, which would be necessary for being in line with the Paris Agreement, were made. And the same regards the EU. While the Green Deal is, of course, a great step forward in the sense of the willpower it dictates, it is still not in line with the emissions cut that we need to be doing. And furthermore, even the promise of 55% that is made, it is not specified where the money needed for this is coming from, which leads to fear in me and many of my generation. And the impact of society was also not a great one, evidently. And I mean society here in the sense of individuals. I know friends where it had a bad hit on mental health, where employment was lost and welfare went down. But I was never prevented from being amazed by the rapid adaptation that people were capable of. In Munich, pop-up cycle lanes appeared, and I now see people signing petitions to keep them in place. And the ability of people such as us here to have conferences in Zoom instead of flying places over by planes, and to see my 70-year-old grandparents suddenly getting on Zoom and learning that they actually like this new format and that they might keep it up afterwards, shows me that society is actually much more resilient and adaptable and capable of change than we think we are. And the other factors that are built up before, talking about media and politics and the economy, they're just built up of the individuals we are. And if we as people can change, then maybe this whole body that has built up all the emissions that have caused the climate crisis can still change itself. And to do this, I think on a policy direction, the most important factor is that we change the rules. We need to make acting in a climate-friendly manner easy. I have the feeling at the moment, as an individual, as a firm, or even as a country, trying to act in a way that leads to us being in line with the 1.5 degree agreement feels a little bit like the stick figure. One is rolling this incredibly large and heavy boulder, which at the same time, one is always worried about it rolling one's over in the sense of the competition of those who are not holding it. But also one feels a little bit ridiculed to see those people who are not making the effort being rewarded for it. And for that, we need to change the rules. We need to change how our systems work so that it is easy to act in a climate-friendly manner, and that one has incentives, and if one had previously had less money, also the possibility to do so. And the other way around, to emit emissions which would be avoidable, we need to make that hard or even impossible. And to be able to do this, to set the rules, we need to know what our goals are. And our goals for an EU level should actually be an 80% reduction of emissions. And when we talk about these reduction emissions and the goals, like be it even the 1.5 Paris Agreement that nearly all countries have signed, when we say ambitious, of course we mean it's going to be hard, but at the same time, it's also necessary. And that's because the climate crisis, though it's a man-made issue, is one that once we reach tipping points is beyond our control. Tipping points are these elements, these phenomenon in nature that once triggered, keep going in a perpetual cycle. So one of them, for example, is the melting of the Greenland ice shields. If they melt, that means the albedo effect is decreased, meaning we have even further warming. And this domino effect through a spiral leads to a further warming and creation of natural disasters that is beyond the control of humans. And two, with a very high probability, avoid these tipping points being reached. We need to stay in line with the emissions budget we have, which would not go beyond 1.5 degrees warming. And the way there is what I'm hoping to hear great solutions from the other presenters today, because I realize for myself as an individual who is not yet in the field of knowing about global politics and economists, it's always a struggle. If I think about maybe the solution being that we need to make the ETS stronger and broader, taking out those exceptions which exist at the moment, the problem of carbon leakage arises. And then if we want to solve that and through a carbon border adjustment mechanism, we are faced perhaps with problems of protectionism as outlined by the World Trade Organizations. And if I then ask for maybe international agreements to come in place, I'm told by people that that is naive belief. But I think given the necessity, as I've outlined, we cannot stop trying. We need to, if other countries and states are not doing climate politics as we need them. We need to be setting an positive example by increasing renewable energies as Portugal is doing it, by introducing free transport for individuals as the case in Luxembourg, and through investment in renewable energy structures. And yes, it's a massive task. We need to reform our agriculture, our energy sources and distribution networks, our transport systems, production chain, data networks, and it doesn't end there. But the good thing is, at the moment, it's still manageable. For example, in Germany, just recently, the Wuppertal Institute published a so-called Machbarkeitsstudie, meaning the technical possibilities of still achieving 2030 net zero for Germany. And what is important when I note this is that just because I say manageable, that doesn't mean that it will necessarily happen. And we cannot be complacent and we definitely must not give up. So my plea, kind of as speaking for the potentially lost generation here, is that we don't give up trying, because this story, the story about climate politics and COVID recovery, will only have a happy end if you help write it. So don't give up on us, please.
Well, thank you very much, Matilda. And now I would like to ask our next speaker, Sue, to shed some light on the consequences of the COVID-19 shutdown on youth unemployment in Europe.
Yes, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Thank you so much for inviting me along this afternoon. And my brief was to talk about the lost generation in terms of youth unemployment. And I'm sad to say that I've sat here for many years and talked about a lost generation in terms of youth unemployment, and we've yet to crack the nut. We talked about a lost generation following the restructuring in the 1980s, the recessions in the 1990s and 2008. And yet young people continue to be punished for their position in the economy and to experience unparalleled levels of unemployment and inactivity. And what I want to talk about this afternoon is really the evidence from a review that I undertook earlier this year for Skills Development Scotland to look at how policy might be tailored to meet the needs of young people as a result of the economic crisis that we are facing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So who are we talking about? And you will be familiar, I'm sure, and it's been mentioned many times already today, about youth unemployment. And I would urge you to think beyond youth unemployment, because I think talking about youth unemployment is a very narrow category, and actually it enables many policymakers to escape from a much larger population of young people who will be marginalised as a result of the economic circumstances that we are facing. While there's been a lot of controversy around the term NEET, which means not in education, employment or training, I have to come down on the side and say that that actually embraces a much broader group of young people, and one that I would urge policymakers to take account of. The NEET group, while it hasn't got such a defined definition as youth unemployment, embraces 16 up to 35-year-olds in some countries, but crucially engages with an unemployed category as well as the economically inactive. As NEET figures stand now, we have more young people who are economically inactive in the NEET group than we have unemployed. I think over the coming months that will change, and we will see rising levels of unemployment. But the economic inactivity group is very important. Why is it important? Because this category of young people includes a large number of young women who are caring or are in early parenting, and young people who are excluded from the labour market because of health reasons. Now, they tend to get pushed back because they are not immediately ready for the labour market. But what we know from previous previous recessions is the number of young women who are categorized as economically inactive tends to rise as they assume domestic responsibilities rather than be classified as unemployed. But as I say, they tend to get pushed back from the policy table and get quietly forgotten about. Unlike previous recessions, we also have young people in much greater numbers throughout Europe and internationally in precarious employment, who will be particularly vulnerable, and large numbers of young people who are now in underemployment. And I think to just think about youth unemployment as the ILO definition is not broad enough. I think we're all familiar as to why young people are so vulnerable in times of economic crisis, basically because of their position in the labour market, their position in the labour queue. They lack the skills and experience, and they're easily dispensable. Therefore, their ranks swell in terms of unemployment and inactivity. This time round, they will be even more seriously affected because large numbers of young people are employed in sectors that are severely affected, most notably hospitality, tourism, etc. They also are subject to precarious rights, employment rights and tenure. And why it is important is because of the long-term scarring effects. And we now have a wealth of research evidence that shows quite clearly that young people who are impacted by unemployment and inactivity will face the consequences of that for 10 to 15 years following the period of unemployment and inactivity. It is very, very important. So what has been tried before? Well, what has been tried before has been well evidenced, and there is a wealth of research that's been conducted, good and bad, about what has worked in what circumstances. And what tends to be rolled out in terms of policy are active labour market policies, and they come under 5 broad headings. And I just want to talk us through briefly about what each one of those comprises. Job search assistance, so these are relatively cheap programs where young people are encouraged to look for work. And the Youth Guarantee is the European Commission's answer to the last recession, where young people were offered, given an offer of employment or training or education within 4 months of registering with a public employment service or an outreach service. Training programs were tried and tested largely in the 1980s, where young people are housed in training programs as an alternative to finding work. The problem with these is that they have large degrees of dead weight and substitution and displacement effects, as do a large number of the other categories listed here too. Subsidized employment programs do work, so paying young people people's wages so that they can take up employment, get experience, and hopefully move on quickly if a recession is short term. One of the problems that faces us with that category now, although it is a very successful measure, is that obviously people are not in the workplace in the same way, and whether employers would be willing to take on young trainees because of social distancing measures and offer the same types of employment opportunities that we had in previous occasions is questionable. Another investment is in job creation, public programs. There was a recent review of the evidence by Speckesser in 2008, which showed that across Europe this had been very effective in previous years, particularly for young adults 20 plus. What's often rolled out by policymakers is startup subsidies, self-employment, let's get young people doing their own thing. It sounds very attractive, but the take-up rates are always very poor, and it is a very risky business to push young people into self-employment when there are not enough jobs to go around. Successful delivery. And when I reviewed the evidence on successful delivery, there is a need to look at young people's needs. What happens too often is that policies are rushed out without looking at young people's needs and, crucially, the economy's needs. And certainly looking across the raft of policy examples that I outlined in the last slide, what works best is when there are a cross-section of interventions that are tailored to the needs of specific groups of young people. And also that they're implemented and there's follow-up and tracking to assess programme performance. What's been a failure in policy over many years is to measure programme performance rather than how it's impacted on young people's lives. So, for example, success is measured in terms of how many people have got jobs rather than what a difference it's made to young people's lives and the quality of the jobs that have actually been given. There is far too much pressure to demonstrate success, and also because of the way that programmes are rewarded in terms of their performance, they tend to focus on work-ready young people rather than the harder to help and the harder to reach. So again, we have a squeezing out of young people who are viewed as problematic rather than focusing on the whole cohort. So in conclusion, really what I want to say is to reiterate some points I've made already, which is we should avoid knee-jerk policies. The key points are targeted programmes, measuring success to include progression towards the labour market as well as securing access to it. And it's including all young people, not just the ones who are immediately successful. Measuring employment outcomes by evaluating quality and sustainability of work, and crucially, contacting young people early identification and intervention are critical. And programmes which combine multiple interventions and services are much more likely to succeed. And certainly one of the examples that I used in the review was a programme that we had in the UK in the 1990s by Prime Minister Gordon Brown, which was a New Deal. And before it was popular and before it was recognised, he made a plea for green jobs and a green option within that programme. And it's interesting that 30 years on, that we should be revisiting that programme and looking perhaps more carefully at the option of creating green jobs within unemployment measures to tackle the needs of young people. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. I would now like to, building on the points, some points mentioned by Matilda earlier, I would like to ask Robert, who's done extensive work over the past decade in advocating for a Green New Deal, to go more into technicalities and details of green recovery. What does, in your opinion, Robert, constitute a politically viable and economically feasible Green New Deal for Europe?
Thank you for having me. And that's exactly what I'm hoping to talk about. And I don't know what happened to my slideshow. Okay. Yeah, again, thank you very much for inviting me. There's a lot, of course, to cover. I'm going to only be able to hit on some few basic points, and we can follow up in a discussion or later. So first of all, let me talk about a broad framework for a global Green New Deal, And there's a lot of details that need to be covered, but the fundamentals are actually quite simple. The fundamentals are as follows. We need to focus on building up clean renewable energy and to dramatically improve energy efficiency. And by energy efficiency, I'm talking about buildings, transportation systems, industrial operations. Clean renewable energy, I'm focused mainly on solar and wind, to a lesser extent the others in the slide. Now, when I say we need to build it up, I think we can be fairly specific. From my own research and other people's research, I would argue that we're looking at an investment level at around 2.5% of GDP, global GDP per year, in order to hit the net zero CO2 emissions target by 2050, and to hit a roughly 50% reduction by 2030, which is basically only in 9 years. And of course, along with that, we've got to stop burning fossil fuels. So we have to cut back, as Matilda referred to. We simply have to keep cutting it. And if we start now, the absolute cut per year is around 3.5%. And then finally, we have to incorporate into the Green New Deal a just transition for all the workers and communities that are already at present dependent on fossil fuels. Okay, so those are the basics, and we can get there. And this program is fully consistent, and this is what I'm going to focus on in a second. It will expand job opportunities, as Sue was just talking about. It is not inconsistent with employment creation, including employment creation for young people. It is not inconsistent with economic growth, depending on how we measure economic growth. Of course, we're going to vastly expand the clean energy economy as we degrow to zero the fossil fuel economy. Those are the basics. I want to just show you some estimates that I've done at various points for such programs in 3 countries in Europe, Germany, Greece, and Spain. And what you're looking at here is the job creation through exactly this program of investments of energy efficiency and clean renewable energy, i.e. solar, wind, so forth. Investments at roughly 3% of GDP. And as I said, we need to think about 2.5% of GDP every year invested globally. It may be different in different countries, but one critical thing is, if we're going to hit a 50% or thereabouts emission reduction target by 2030, we have to ramp up the investment activity more now, and then we can do somewhat less from 2031 to 2050. Anyway, how many jobs do we get? Well, you can see. In Germany, at 3% of GDP, investing in clean energy, we get 1.7 million jobs. In Greece, which is obviously a much smaller economy, we get 120,000 jobs. And in Spain, we get 825,000 jobs. If you look at this column to the right, we're looking at about 2.5 to 3.5% job creation in each of these countries. Okay, now you may say, well, that's not that big, 2.5%, 3.5%. Well, it is. It's very big because in Germany, which has one of the lowest unemployment rates in Europe right now, it's 6.3%. So you're going to shave that to roughly almost 3 percentage points, to 3.3%. Greece, unemployment's over 17%. Well, it's not going to solve all the unemployment problems, but it will get it down from, say, 17% to 14%, and so forth. And these are jobs that will be available broadly. There are jobs in all areas of activity. Yes, of course, there are jobs for people installing solar panel on roofs, on building electric cars, but there are also jobs for people doing basic retrofits of buildings, for people driving trucks to deliver equipment, for people delivering lunch to work sites. It's jobs across the board for secretaries, for accountants, and so forth. And so that's really the opportunity. And that's the thing that we can focus on right now as part of a recovery program out of the COVID crisis, which is also a clean energy sustainable trajectory, something that Matilda was just talking about, combining a solution out of the COVID-generated recession and then putting us on a path of long-term sustainability. Now, a second source of job creation, in addition to what I just showed you, is that what will happen over time is that when countries such as Germany, Greece, and Spain, all three of them, which are energy importers, when you start substituting out of your imported fossil fuel energy and build up your own green energy sources, over time, you will start building up employment through that channel as well. It's called import substitution is the term in economics. And now this one is more gradual, but over time, by 2050, this is the case of Greece, by 2050, the net increase is 110,000 jobs, which as you see is basically equivalent to the investment increase of 120,000 jobs. 120,000 jobs in Greece we get immediately through investing 3%, but over time we also get this additional benefit through import substitution. Okay, now another benefit which is not usually recognized is that building the green economy will cost people less money. It will make energy cheaper. So even if you don't care at all about saving the planet, which you should, but even if you don't, let's just look at a bit of evidence here. These are figures from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, on the cost of renewable energy versus fossil fuel energy. And as you can see, this is the figure for fossil fuel energy average worldwide, ranging between 5 cents and 17.7 cents. And now let's just look at the figures quickly. On renewable, 2019, solar is at, these are in US dollars, 6.8 cents, onshore wind, 5.3 cents, hydro, 4.7, geothermal, 7.3. So all in the lower range today of the average range for fossil fuel energy. Now, on top of that, this is how much you would pay for how much you consume. What we also have to take into account is the investments in energy efficiency, which will enable us to consume a lot less energy to get the same service. In other words, a lot less electricity for me to continue to light and heat my house that I'm sitting in right now. On average, we can allow for maybe 40% cut in energy consumption through efficiency on average, in addition to getting these benefits of having the actual cost per unit come down. So building the green economy will cost people less money relative to maintaining the fossil fuel economy. Okay, now how much do we have to spend? And this is a critical point because Matilda referred to this, getting to scale, and I want to emphasize this. What I said was we need to think about 2.5% of GDP every year globally. It's a little bit different for some countries than others, but that's the range. Now, and we have to think about a high-end figure for the first 10 years, so somewhere closer to 3%. Now, the European Green Deal is a breakthrough, a very positive development in terms of the rhetoric and in terms of the commitments that it is talking about. But the amount of money that is being assumed is adequate to achieve the goals of the European Green Deal are simply far from adequate. They're inadequate. I want to emphasize this to a European audience. So if we look at the Green New Deal investment plan of January 2020, it calls for 1 trillion euros over 10 years. So that averages about 100 billion per year. That amounts to 0.7% of GDP. That's not good enough. And just in case you thought I got it wrong, here's the figure right from the document. And so it says, well, it does say at least 1 trillion. I'm okay with the at least. We need it to be well above 1 trillion. But the thing that comes from this diagram is they are talking about all sorts of funding, not just from the EU budget, but funding from all governments and funding from the private sector as well. The figure is simply not adequate. Okay. Now, it is true that the European Green Deal communication, which I also just looked at from last November, does talk about spending at 1.5% of GDP. So there is some disconnect between this document from last November and the one from a few months ago in terms of the amount, the magnitude of spending that we need. That needs to be clarified. 0.7% of GDP, not nearly enough. 1.5% of GDP is at the very low end of adequacy, and certainly not adequate for the next decade, and certainly not adequate to help get us out of the recession and put us on a long-term path of sustainability. Okay, and how do we fund it? Here's 4 examples. We can think about a carbon tax, cutting military spending, eliminating fossil fuels, and the European Central Bank supporting green bonds, which is what they have already said, at least in the rhetoric, what they have committed to doing. If you use all 4 of these tools, not any one of them has to bear the full burden of this financing. And I'll just say something very quickly about the carbon tax. We know what happened in France last year when Macron tried to introduce a carbon tax, and it caused the Yellow Vest movement to oppose it. The problem was not the carbon tax. The problem was the way it was designed. When you have a carbon tax, you have to realize that it is going to hit middle income and lower income people disproportionately, and that therefore you need to rebate something like 75% of the revenues. When you do that, the carbon tax is egalitarian. When you don't do that, it is regressive and it hurts low-income people. So that was a disastrous matter of policy design, needs to be corrected. Finally, I'll just mention, what are the things that should not go into the Green Deal for Europe or elsewhere? What things are not going to get us to the goals we need? Natural gas, building out natural gas as is being contemplated, for example, in the Mediterranean now, is not a bridge fuel. It will not get us to zero emissions because burning natural gas, though it's cleaner than coal, is not a clean fuel. The argument for burning natural gas as a clean fuel is that, okay, we can use carbon capture technology. Carbon capture technology is not proven at scale despite decades of effort. And so we cannot assume that certainly over the next decade, carbon capture is going to help get us to zero emissions. And then finally, nuclear energy is a zero emission energy source, but it has the public safety, massive public safety and political problems that we know are surrounding nuclear. And so that back again to the core of the project is investing in energy efficiency, clean renewable energy, and a just transition for workers moving out of the fossil fuel economy. And I'll just end with the EU's own taxonomy for financing a sustainable European economies, a document that just came out. We need measures that will positively contribute and also will not do significant harm. These measures, natural gas, carbon capture, and nuclear, can do significant harm, and that therefore we need to maintain our focus on the ones that will get us to zero emissions, create jobs in the short run, and put us on a path of sustainable recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. I would now like to ask Deborah, last presenter, to tell us about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on investment in Europe and the ways the current situation requires investment to adapt.
Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to have a chance to speak after what I heard so far, after the intervention of Matilda, Sue, and Robert, because I think I very much share the points that they have made, and I will try to reconnect to them. The first message that I want to pass is that the COVID crisis has been a massive shock, and it will generate a slow recovery at the European level. But the crisis is reinforcing a number of structural challenges and macro trends that were already there, and where the crisis is just reinforcing the challenge. As Matilda was saying, the climate transformation on the one side, but also the digital transformation on the other are important challenges that require firms and region and people to adapt. And the focus on people is very much what Sue was mentioning. And there, I think I will try to mention that the lost generation is probably not only the younger generation. There is also something that may happen in terms, and that has very strong impact in terms of inequality in Europe, related to regions, so geographical location, and also to middle-aged workers. And then I focus on the real focus and opportunity is to work on recovering from the crisis and focus on a smart and green recovery. And here, the optimal sequencing of policy response is something that we have really to discuss to make sure that moving toward this smart and green recovery keeps all the incentive correct. And on this part, I will very much link to what Robert just told us in very nice details. So I start from the first economic thinking. So for sure, we have seen the very strong impact on the crisis on European GDP growth. It has been massive. And over the summer, we have started seeing some sign of recovery, but again, uncertainty is back, uncertainty which is having a very strong impact on the economic growth and which is delaying the path of recovery. We always had a scenario where recovery will not be back to the growth will
I am afraid that we lost Deborah. Let's wait a little and hope that the line will recover. That is really unfortunate. Okay, apparently it is taking more time to reconnect than while we're trying to reconnect with Deborah. I would suggest responding to one interesting question that came in. And Robert, that is in a way a question addressed to you. It says, nice to see how many jobs will be created. However, how many jobs will be lost in the green transition? Would you like to address this question? And then hopefully we will have Deborah back with us soon.
Sure, happy to address it. you know, the scale of the job creation versus the job lost is really massively in favor of job creation. And we can measure that in two ways. First of all, we can measure it simply in terms of a given amount of spending for clean energy versus fossil fuel energy. And in all the countries I've looked at, including the ones Spain, Greece, and Germany, and Europe, and elsewhere, the job creation through the clean energy investments are 2 to 3 times bigger per dollar of expenditure than those in the fossil fuel economy. And the reason is straightforward. They're more labor intensive. That is, for a given amount of spending on any activity, you require more employment versus other economic inputs. Number two, talking about the domestic content, as I did before, you have a higher domestic content through clean energy versus fossil fuel energy. Those are the two big factors. So, you know, 2 to 3 times more jobs across a range of countries. Now, but even that understates the differential, because what we're talking about are really two different trajectories. We're talking about increasing 3% or thereabouts of GDP into clean energy. At the same time, what we're really talking about with the fossil fuel economy is a gradual phase out. And we're talking about phase out, you know, over 10, 20 years. And during that phase out period, so we, you know, if there's, well, I'll give you the number for Greece, that's one I'm most familiar with right now. In fossil fuels, in coal, there's 6,000 jobs total. If we phase them out over a decade, that's 600 jobs per year, okay? Now, on top of that, if we look at the demographics and we have, let's say, 25% of those workers are between 55 and 65 and would have retired anyway, okay? So we're down to about 400 jobs per year lost in Greece through this transition in the coal sector, while we are creating, as I showed you before, 120,000 jobs through clean energy investments. Now, the numbers will vary in detail country to country, but that's roughly the scale. And so that's why I emphasize the just transition for the fossil fuel workers. Each of them needs to get a decent pension guarantee, a job guarantee in something else, and we need to invest in the heavy regions which are dependent on fossil fuels now. For example, in Germany, in the Ruhr Valley, where you probably have the most progressive alternative land reclamation and repurposing projects being undertaken. I've used that as a model for work I'm doing here in the US. So overall, again, analytically, on paper, economically, it's very easy to implement a really generous, just transition for all workers and communities in the fossil fuel economy now. The issue is whether there's the political will to achieve it. And again, not to harp on this, if the European Green Deal, if the people are committed, then you can't think about 100 billion euros a year. That's simply not enough to get us where we need to go. So that needs to be a major focus of understanding the scale. It doesn't have to be 10% of GDP. It needs to be 2 to 3% of GDP. It can't be 0.5% of GDP.
Thank you very much, Robert. I am afraid we have to continue without Deborah for the moment because it looks like her device froze. In the meantime, we received another interesting question, but maybe we'll postpone it until Deborah comes back because it regards investment in just transition policies as well. But let me ask you before we continue, let me ask all of you for your take or for one or two most important policy recommendations for you, policy recommendations you have at the moment. We can begin with Matilda.
I think very much in line with my talking about changing the rules. I think one of the most important factors would just be a carbon tax, and that carbon tax has to be set at a level that at the end, you want the carbon tax to basically take into account all the costs that it caused. There's the external costs, but initially it just has to be set so high, at least, that it provides enough incentive, basically, that that companies given these new costs through the tax, then decide to change their methods of production. And that depends on the countries and sets, but that means many of the studies that are conducted, which suggest like a carbon tax of 20 euros, are just not enough. And I think, as in line with what Robert was saying, these measures have to be implemented in a just way that is societally acceptable, meaning that it has to be in line with some kind of compensation or a general reallocation or distribution of wealth to those who would be disproportionately affected by it.
Thank you, Matilda. Sue, what, in your opinion, or what is your most important policy recommendations, a recommendation apart from a more targeted assessment, as you mentioned earlier?
I think we need to have a commitment to reach all groups of young people, not just those who appear to be labour market ready. And I think we need to come up with a cocktail of employment and support interventions that not only relieve the current situation, but create good quality jobs and sustainable jobs for young people moving forward, so that we never face this term lost generation again in relation to recession.
This sounds very hopeful. Thank you, Sue. And now, as Deborah is still having problems, unfortunately, I would like to go to some more questions, and there's some really interesting questions coming in. Our audience wants to know more about just transition, and I think can you see the questions, Robert? Or would you I mean, basically, yes, there are questions about more details on just transition and mitigation policies for workers directly affected by carbon tax, and whether the panelists could explore on instruments and institutions who will spend and invest in this principle.
Okay, so I also am a proponent of a carbon tax, as I showed, but I'm not in favor of it as the only policy tool. It needs to be a part of an overall set of interventions. And so, yeah, so the carbon tax with redistribution, so that when you redistribute the money back to people, you're not going to have the full amount available to invest in clean energy, and we need to get to clean energy at 2 to 3% of GDP. The additional sources of funding that will create investments in clean energy and thereby create jobs. Yes, we can talk about cutting military budgets. In the recent book I just did called A Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal, we talk about a 5% cut in military spending across the board, every country. Well, that will fall disproportionately on the US because we have by far the largest military budget. We also talk about eliminating all fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies, it makes no sense whatsoever, except that they, in many countries, are used to effectively subsidize low-income people that can't afford energy at market prices. So when we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, again, we need to transform them into clean energy subsidies, even to drive down the cost of consuming clean energy to nominal amounts. Some colleagues of mine have written about this for the case of India, that clean energy given out free, absolutely free, subsidized by the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies and the carbon tax. And the last thing is the role of the financial sector. And I briefly was citing the work, at least the proposals of the European Central Bank, which in my view are, very favorable and forward-looking in terms of what they're saying. They haven't done a whole lot yet, but they are talking about creating, a green bond fund that would enable very, very low cost and very long-term financing for a green transition. So that has to be implemented, and that is an enormously powerful tool that isn't talked about enough. The transition part, yes, I mean, the number of jobs that are going to be created through green investments swamp the number of jobs that will be lost year to year through the contraction of the fossil fuel industry. Absolutely, overwhelmingly much bigger in every country. Therefore, we need to focus on the transition for people and make sure they have good policies for transition, meaning that their pensions are guaranteed, meaning when they transition to a new job, their wages are guaranteed, meaning they get retraining, and meaning they get relocation support. I've just done that actually for a study for the US, which is actually being launched in about 2 hours. The numbers that I calculated, at least for the US, if we do all of those just transition policies for all of the fossil fuel workers in the United States today, we're looking at a number that's 1/100th of 1% of GDP, like $2 to $3 billion a year. This is in a $20 trillion economy. The numbers will be a little different for different countries, but roughly equivalent. So those are the commitments that I think are critical.
Thank you very much, Robert. I would like to ask Sue a question regarding reallocation as well, because in the way the COVID-19 pandemic is a reallocation shock as well, with some persistent aspects. Some sectors will not work as they used to, probably ever, or will take a long time to recover. What does it mean for policy? What does it mean for training? What does it mean for young people who are now neat because of the situation?
I think we need to act, and I think we need to act promptly. I think we need to invest in training and job support methods. I also firmly believe that we also need to reach beyond putting resource into just public employment services and saying that's an issue for them. I think we have to reach out to communities that are increasingly excluded, and to make contact with a broader group of young people than those who turn up for public employment services. So, for example, looking at the UK, we know that only 50% of young people who are unemployed claim welfare support. So where are they? And they also, when they do, have very high incidence of sanctioning, which suggests that they don't like public employment services, and when they do, they tangle with them badly. And I think we need to look at our institutions that support young people and make them far more inclusive. That's before we start talking about policies to support them, because if we don't understand their needs, what's the point in throwing out policies that where we think it might be appropriate for them? I think we really need to engage with young people to a far greater extent.
This sounds very promising. Thank you very much, Sue. And I'm extremely happy to see Deborah back, and I hope that now you can use the rest of the time of the session. We managed to answer some questions that come in. So we restructured it a little, but please use the rest of the session time for your presentation and about digital transformation and COVID.
Did you? I just don't know when I lost you, because I realized that at the very end.
Oh no! Oh, that is. Unfortunately, it did come pretty early. It was your third slide. COVID-19 economic crisis, a slow recovery. Okay, should I go very? I think I will go very quickly on the main message. Maybe without the slides, just touching the key points. That would be. Yes. I think the key message that I wanted to pass is that on the one side, we see this crisis having a massive effect on the firms in a moment in which, can you hear me? Yeah. In a moment in which the firms are substantially constraining their investment activities, but it's also a moment in which firms per se, they would need to start investing in order to adapt to a new normal that requires more digitalization, more innovation, and more investment for climate change. On the other side, we see at the regional level, if we look at the region in Europe, we see regions that are particularly affected by this twin transition, as we define it. So the climate transition on the one side and the digital transition. What we find out is that the regions that are particularly affected are also very strongly affected by COVID on the one side, because they have a less reaction capacity. And also they tend to be already poorer regions that are less innovative, less digital. So we kind of find that the challenge are all coming all together. So the challenge of COVID, the challenge of transformation in digital, and the challenge for transformation in climate. We also look at the opportunity that digital and climate bring. Actually, there are new opportunities in terms both of job creation, like also Robert was mentioning, related both to the green transition and to the digital transition. And the message, the final message that I wanted to pass is that in order to catch this opportunity, we have to work with people supporting reskilling and adapting to the new jobs that are going to be generated. And the reskilling part is not only for the lost generation as the young one, but also for the middle-age group of people that are non-digital today, and also that work in sector more affected by the climate transition. So there is a policy intervention very much focusing on reskilling that we need to bring forward. On a policy point of view, I think Europe is moving in the right direction. It's trying to create the framework for investment to concentrate in digitalization and in climate transition, and is also trying to put forward the incentive for the reskilling part of the population. And that's something quite unique to create a framework around which all these policies should take place. In a nutshell, this is the main message that I wanted to pass, and I'm sorry that it ended up abruptly blocked by the technologies. Yes, that's the experience you have to make. I guess that's we have to take it as it comes. I just wanted to briefly, before we maybe can have an opportunity to answer one or two questions. I'm afraid Matilda has to leave us because she has an appointment with her professor. I would like to thank you very much, Matilda, for joining us, and good luck to you, and we'll hope to Now we can turn to a couple of questions. We had some very interesting questions also regarding investment and a just transition and retraining. And one person from the audience was asking about instruments to achieve just transition and where investment would come in from. And I was wondering whether, Deborah, you would like to address, we still have a couple of minutes, whether you would like to address this question.
I think the investment has to come from a combination of public and private effort. On the one side, the public sector has to create the framework and potentially the incentive, but the framework mostly for private sector investment to kickstart. And the framework, I think, I always said the just transition tends to be associated to climate change only, but I think the just transition should be really associated both to climate change and digitalisation. It's a more cohesive transition that we should see. So on the one side, I think on the climate transition part, I think part of the framework, the important element is to create a certainty in terms of the regulation point of view. The taxonomy is very important in defining which are the areas of activities and investment that should be considered and treated. And then we can have financial instruments that goes either incentivizing local authorities to invest, or the private sector to invest, or the banks to treat this kind of investment. And then this created a framework for private sector investment as well to kickstart. So it's a combination of efforts that we are also trying to support as an institution.
Thank you very much. And finally, Deborah, I would like to ask you one last question. Having discussed a number of topics here today, what is your main, one or two main policy recommendations for?
I think the main policy recommendation is the optimal sequencing of policies. So in the very short term, to address the crisis, a lot of measures have been put in place dealing with the short-term problem. So keeping people on job, keeping firms afloat. But in the medium term, we have to shift the policy incentive in order to support the transformation. So yes, keeping people in job, but preparing people for new jobs and stimulating, incentivizing the reskilling on the one side, and also firms, supporting firms, but preparing firms for investment in digital and for the climate transition in order to prepare the firms for the future. So it's a combination of policy support with a first part that is focusing, that should be really short term, but a medium term strategies that push the firms and the individual to transform.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And I would like to thank all panelists for joining us today, and we look forward to reading your papers in a special forum that is going to be published in late November. And I would like to remind the audience that you can use the same link to reconnect with us in 15 minutes for a conversation between Daniel Gross and Barry Eichengreen. Thank you again. Thank you very much.